I've always thought she was, and I say this in the original book and repeat it, that she's a sort of mythological character. So people will be interested in her in hundreds of years, even when they don't really know what she did, like Churchill or Napoleon.
Working too hard, really. I can say that's more.
You're taking your own life.
Do you mind having a bit of this coffee?
She was very theatrical, so she said, here's the report on this, and here's the report on that, and here's the white paper. And so she produced 6 things that had all come out this week. And they say we're doing nothing. Throwing them all down on the table. That sort of was acting, but also speaking very directly. Very good flatterer, actually.
Right.
And particularly good at flattering people who are outside her specific sphere. So she loved intellectuals, scientists, businessmen, soldiers, more than she loved other politicians. Though she had tremendous ego, huge ego, she didn't have male vanity. So what happens with male politicians is that what they want to get you to repeat the story of how brilliant they were, particularly how cunning they were or funny. She just couldn't care less about that. So her idea of an interview was very strange, because all the interviews she'd done in life were sort of interviews on television and so on. So she couldn't get out of her head, though she herself commissioned me to write the book, that, and we were on good personal terms, that it was like being interviewed by Robin Day, on the telly during an election or something, or other great figures of the time, like
Brian Walden, for example.
Brian Walden, yes, with whom she fell out, having been very close. Yeah. And so she would evade my questions quite often, and she would say, you only say that because you're a socialist, or something like that. And she would want to turn it into an argument.
Right.
And
self-justification?
Yes, and evasion of certain things that are difficult. I said something very basic, like, I was just at the very beginning of it, I said, what did your mother do? And she said, well, she was a seamstress, a very good seamstress, and she also did wonderful voluntary work. And that's the thing about the women of Britain. They do wonderful voluntary work, not like French women. And we were away from, she was desperate to get away.
Right.
And so you had to sort of let the waves break over you. On the whole, I would say Mrs. Thatcher was a truthful person, particularly by the standards of politicians, and found it very difficult to tell a lie. But the one thing where she definitely lied to me was, I said, did you have any boyfriends before Dennis? And she said no, and it was, as I discovered, totally untrue. Not only had she had several boyfriends, but in 1951 she'd had 3 at the same time, because she was trying to work out who the serious one was. One of them was Dennis. One of the fascinations of her character is that she didn't examine herself much, so I was doing the examining, not her. But I think what she was always thinking is, I want to marry, I want to have children, but I want to be a member of Parliament, and that's very difficult for a woman, and I have no money. How am I going to do all this? So she wanted true love, but she also wanted security, and somebody who was sympathetic to this, what was then a very unusual career pattern. So that's what's going on in all these early years at Oxford, and when she's a young candidate and so on, and when she's working as an industrial chemist, and when she's reading for the bar. And she always wanted to be Mrs. Thatcher. She never thought of keeping her maiden name of Roberts. And she entirely accepted the outer conventions of these matters. And she did want all that, and one of the things, and she often saw things very physically, so she was very keen on domestic detail, and the house being tidy, and everything being very well done and snug in the house, and that sort of thing. And she also was a seamstress, and she knew about how to alter her clothes, and she was very interested in clothes, and, all such matters. But there was this overriding ambition, which was there all the time. People sometimes say, it's good that Mrs. Thatcher had a wider experience of life than just being an MP, because she worked in industry and she worked as a barrister. And that's true, it was a good experience, but never, ever, ever did she want to be a barrister or a chemist. She wanted to be a member of Parliament. He was steadfast and loyal, but he was always working very hard.
Yeah.
So he was no no house husband at all.
No.
And he had a quite high-powered job as
Yep.
in industry, and he was much older than her, 11 years older, and he'd been in the war and so on. This is another reason why she loved him. Actually, she could look up to him. He's higher class, more money, good war record, older, and she liked all those things.
Right.
And respected them. But it meant that he was not at all the type of husband who would take on the burden of the children when she's away. In fact, when they had a flat in Chelsea Manor Street when they first married, Dennis immediately bought the flat next door so that, as he put it, I could slam the door on the whole lot of them. So it was adjoining flats. Though she was horrible, she was quite horrible to some people, but they were all big people, important people. She was never horrible to unimportant people because she didn't think them unimportant. So the secretary, the driver, the policeman, she really valued their loyalty and support, and sort of understood their lives, I think, much better than a man would. So, for example, when all those soldiers were killed at Warren Point very early on by the IRA, very early on in her career, she wrote a personal letter to each widow, 18 widows, which no Prime Minister had ever thought of doing before, and she kept that up all the time, that sort of thing. And she wouldn't let go. She'd ask to see them later and that sort of thing. And she was never very interested in people's wives. There was a famous handshake that she gave to the wives, which is like a sort of judo throw. So they were sort of introduced in the line of people.
Right.
And the man she would stop and talk to.
As you said, you began talking to her at a point at which...
she did meet. Sorry, I'm just telling you. She did meet my wife, of course, and Dennis was more of a talkative to the wives, and she met our children. And sorry, this is a diversion, but it's quite nice what happened because it shows both how sort of friendly she was, but also what an odd idea about people she had. So we were staying with Julian Seamer and our children, they're twins, and they were 7, and. After lunch, it was just me in the drawing room with her and actually Ed Llewellyn, who's now the British ambassador in Rome, who was then had a job in Conservatory Central Office or something. And all the other guests weren't there for some reason. And in came our son. And I thought he didn't really know who Mrs. Thatcher was. And he sat down. And he couldn't pronounce his L's at that time. He said, "Did you like being Prime Minister?" So she said, well, we had the chance to make important decisions and improve the life of our country. So yes, we enjoyed it very much. So he said, "Did you make some good yours then?" She said, "Yes, we did. We made Britain strong in defence, we reduced the power of the trade unions, and we cut taxes. So that if people keep more of what they earn more." So the interview at this point went downhill because Will said, "Oh, did you get very rich when you were Prime Minister?" and she said, "No, we did not. In fact, we forewent some of our income."
So she's talking to him as if he was Robin Day.
Exactly. It was charming, I thought. I mean, but also a very odd thing that she'd been a mother and she didn't quite understand what little children are like. This is what they never get in films like The Crown or something, is her company was very enjoyable. It's because she was so electric. So though she wasn't funny ha-ha, it was fun. And she would camp up her own reaction. She'd almost do like a sort of, "Oh, you are awful," sort of. And she enjoyed, though she was fundamentally, I think, a solitary, even a lonely person, she liked human company, enjoyed parties, good host, sort of moving people around, introducing them to one another. And also, though she was, some people would say she was power crazed, and she certainly loved having power, she never lost that. She was a straightforward, unpompous person. She was still very much the very direct woman from a very direct part of provincial England.
Yeah. So Margaret Roberts.
Yeah.
And clearly one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, and certainly in British politics,
Yes.
probably the most consequential figure of the 20th century.
Yes, and I think globally, this is the other thing, and indeed the only country where people don't really like her much is Britain.